"Swarm inbound! Swarm inbound! All hands to battle stations!" The sharp voice of the combat officer cut through the silence, mixing with the general quarters alarm that echoed across the Gulf of Oman at 4:15. Thousands of sailors aboard the supercarrier USS Abraham Lincoln were pulled from sleep into a scenario no one wanted to face. The pride of the U.S. Navy, often seen as an untouchable fortress at sea, had just stepped into a carefully prepared trap. Across the carrier group, the most advanced radar systems in the world lit up with warning signals. Dozens, then hundreds of incoming contacts appeared almost at once, flooding the screens faster than operators could sort them. For 48 hours, the opposing force had remained hidden beneath the towering cliffs of the Omani coastline, using powerful jamming systems to blend into the natural clutter of the terrain. At the center of this operation was the Shahed Bagheri, a secretive $555 million platform that U.S. intelligence had lost track of. Now, as it moved out from the shadow of the mountains and reached the perfect launch position, its bays opened. Within moments, waves of loitering drones and unmanned surface boats surged toward the American carrier. For the first time in the modern era, an aircraft carrier strike group found itself surrounded at close range by a coordinated swarm designed to overwhelm every layer of defense. The distance was only 15 nautical miles, and it was shrinking fast. Could the U.S. defense network respond in time, or was this the moment the world began questioning the future of the aircraft carrier? At 4:30, Iran's strategy fully unfolded, and it was far more complex than anything Pentagon planners had modeled on paper. From the flight deck of the mothership Shahed Bagheri, more than 50 Shahed 136 one-way drones lifted off alongside the newest armed reconnaissance UAVs, operating under the codename September 25001. This was not a conventional strike pattern. The drones used sea-skimming flight, racing just above the surface at less than 10 meters in altitude. By hiding behind the waves, they reduced their radar signature and made early detection far more difficult. At the same time, from the flooded rear compartment of the vessel, 50 Ashura and Blade Runner-class fast boats were released. Built with stealth-style composite hulls and carrying NASA-1 short-range anti-ship systems, they formed a tight encirclement before accelerating toward the carrier group at nearly 90 kilometers per hour. Inside the Combat Information Center aboard the lead destroyer USS Spruance, the mood turned heavy and tense. Iranian electronic warfare systems blasted powerful interference across the S and X bands, turning the Aegis radar display into a storm of false signals, ghost contacts, and distorted returns. Operators struggled to separate real threats from jamming, wave reflections, and fast-moving boats carrying heavy payloads. Then came another problem. The noise from hundreds of high-speed engines created a wall of acoustic confusion, making it harder for the strike group's sonar systems to track what was moving beneath and across the water. Iran's opening move had worked. The U.S. had lost much of its long-range advantage. A carrier strike group worth billions had been forced into a close-range confrontation where technology, precision, and planning were being challenged by speed, numbers, and surprise. In a situation this chaotic, could the U.S. still turn the battle around? Comment yes or no below and keep watching. At 4:35, the highest level of battle readiness, General Quarters, was activated across the entire USS Abraham Lincoln strike group. The destroyers USS Spruance and USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. immediately surged ahead, breaking away from formation to build a defensive screen roughly 10 kilometers from the carrier. Their mission was clear: place themselves between the incoming swarm and the USS Abraham Lincoln, becoming the carrier's last protective wall. The Mark 45 5-inch naval guns on both ships opened up first, sending proximity-fused airburst rounds over the water. Each round scattered a storm of metal fragments across the surface, trying to break apart the formation of fast boats racing toward them. Along the sides of the ships, Mark 38 25mm automatic guns fired non-stop, targeting any boat that slipped through the outer defensive layer, while also tracking the Shahed drones closing in from above. Moments later, short-range RIM-116 missiles launched one after another from the ship's defensive systems. They curved sharply into the incoming drone wave, cutting through the low sky over the Gulf of Oman as the sea and air turned into a chaotic battlefield of flashing impacts, smoke, and thunderous shock waves. Above the fleet, 4 F/A-18E Super Hornets entered the fight. The American pilots dropped close to the water, sweeping across the enemy formation with their 20mm M61 Vulcan cannons. Tracer rounds streaked across the surface like burning lines in the darkness. Meanwhile, MH-60R Seahawk helicopters moved in low, using Hellfire missiles to target the lead boats by tracking their wakes across the water. At first, the response looked highly effective. Dozens of bright columns rose from the sea as 12 of the lead Iranian boats were torn apart by American firepower. The radar picture began to look cleaner, and U.S. commanders started to believe their precision weapons were breaking the attack. It looked like the enemy force might pull back, just as others had done in previous encounters when faced with the full strength of the U.S. Navy. But that confidence came too soon. The truth was far more dangerous. The boats and drones that had been taken out were only the first layer of the plan. Iran had pushed them forward to overload the Aegis system, fill the radar screens with targets, and force the destroyers to burn through their ready-use ammunition. At the same time, thick black smoke from the damaged craft spread across the water, forming a natural screen that blocked American electro-optical sensors. Behind that wall of smoke, the real strike force was still intact, moving forward with cold precision. At exactly 0442, Iran's trap closed at high speed. From behind the drifting smoke, the mothership Shahed Bagheri activated the second phase of the assault. Qarar UAVs, armed with upgraded Majid heat-seeking missiles, suddenly climbed from just above the sea surface. Their targets were not the heavily protected warships. Instead, they went after the thinner-skinned MH-60R Seahawk helicopters, flying low as they searched for fast boats. Caught from an unexpected angle, 2 American helicopters were struck, trailing smoke as their crews were forced into emergency water landings. In a matter of seconds, the carrier group lost some of its most important eyes for close-range surveillance. Then, using the confusion created by the broken low-altitude defense layer, the armed September 2051 reconnaissance UAVs suddenly changed course. Instead of continuing their approach pattern, they dropped into steep terminal dives aimed directly at the SPY-6 radar arrays on the command tower of the USS Spruance. A massive blast shook the destroyer. The starboard radar array was knocked out, leaving a dangerous 90-degree blind zone inside the Aegis defense network. What had already been a critical situation quickly spiraled into something far worse when the U.S. passive sonar system, still overwhelmed by the chaotic surface noise, detected a new contact at extremely close range. Beneath the confusion of waves, engines, and electronic interference, 2 Iranian Ghadir-class mini-submarines had quietly slipped through the outer defense perimeter. Before the American crews could fully react, they released Hoot super-cavitating torpedoes. Moving at nearly 360 kilometers per hour, the torpedoes formed a super-cavitation bubble around themselves, allowing them to cut through the water with incredible speed. That same effect made standard acoustic countermeasures almost useless. Moments later, the torpedo alert echoed through the compartments of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The supercarrier had no choice. It began a hard, evasive turn, leaning nearly 15 degrees as it tried to move out of the torpedo's path. The sudden maneuver threw the flight deck into chaos and immediately forced all F/A-18 launch operations to stop. The entire American formation had been broken apart. Above them, drones continued to circle and close in. On the surface, fast attack boats pressed forward through the confusion. Beneath the waves, high-speed underwater weapons had entered the fight. For the first time in decades, the pride of the U.S. Navy found itself trapped inside a 3-layer threat environment, struggling to regain control. At 0450, the fleet commander understood the hard truth. Trying to intercept every single UAV was no longer a winning strategy. The destroyers had limited ready-use ammunition, while the Shahed Bagheri mothership still had the ability to launch more systems into the fight. A different approach was needed. The order came quickly. Stop spreading fire across the entire swarm and focus on the source of command and control. Instead of chasing every drone, every boat, and every signal, the strike group would target the brain behind the operation. High above the battle, a P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft flying at 30,000 feet immediately changed its mission. Instead of focusing on sonobuoy deployment, it activated its broadband electronic warfare systems and began coordinating with 2 EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft that had just launched with next-generation jamming pods. But the U.S. did not blanket the whole area with interference. That would have created problems for its own sensors. Instead, American systems used AI-assisted analysis to identify and isolate the specific satellite communication frequency that the Shahed Bagheri was using to control and coordinate the swarm. Once that frequency was found, the Growlers began transmitting focused jamming beams directly into the channel. They combined selective interference with spoofed signals, feeding the swarm false information without blinding the American fleet. The impact was immediate. Inside the Iranian UAV network, targeting data began to shift. The position of the American carrier suddenly appeared to move 5 kilometers away from its actual location. Dozens of Shahed 136 one-way drones adjusted course at once, diving toward empty water and detonating far from the carrier group. On the surface, the Ashura fast boat formation lost its connection to the mothership. Without centralized coordination, the formation began to break down. Some boats moved in conflicting directions, others crossed into each other's paths, and several lost their attack rhythm completely. More importantly, as the Shahed Bagheri increased its transmission power in an attempt to regain control of the swarm, it made a critical mistake. The mothership lit up across the electromagnetic spectrum like a beacon, exposing its exact position to American targeting systems. In a matter of minutes, the battle had changed. The swarm was no longer moving as one. The command link had been disrupted, and the platform that had been controlling the entire operation was no longer hidden. The hunter had become the target. But even with the swarm fractured, the danger was far from over. The three most persistent one-way boats, now cut off from central control, kept racing toward the destroyer. Even more concerning, the Shahed Bagheri had finally revealed its position, but its launch systems were still largely intact. If it regained control, it could begin another wave at any moment. At 05:05, the American admiral made a high-risk decision. The AC-13OJ Ghost Rider would be sent in to disable the mothership. It was a bold move. The aircraft was powerful, but not built for speed or agility, which made it vulnerable in a crowded battle space. To give it a chance, F/A-18E fighters dropped low and acted as decoys, pulling Iranian air defense attention away from the real objective. While the fighters created the opening, the AC-13OJ moved in from medium altitude, banking into position and lining up its 30mm cannon and 105mm precision system. The order from command was clear: disable the ship, but do not send it to the bottom. American crews used laser-guided rounds with extreme accuracy, focusing only on two critical areas of the Shahed Bagheri: the fire control radar array and the propulsion system at the stern. The strikes tore through the upper structure, turning the ship's electronics into useless metal and leaving it unable to maneuver. At the same time, they avoided setting off the large ammunition storage area inside the hull. Below the surface and across the waves, the final moments of the battle were unfolding. Three Iranian one-way boats broke through the last defensive layer and closed to within just 500 meters of the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. The ship's last line of defense, the CIWS Phalanx system, came alive automatically. Its rapid-fire burst sounded like a giant mechanical saw as tungsten rounds formed a wall of metal in front of the destroyer. Two of the boats were ripped apart before they could reach the ship. But the third boat, already damaged and burning, continued forward on momentum alone and slammed into the starboard side of the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. A violent blast shook the formation, and thick black smoke rolled from the side of the destroyer. A large opening appeared just above the waterline. But the ship's modern watertight compartment design held. It stayed afloat, kept power, and remained in the fight. As the first light of dawn appeared over the Gulf of Oman, the smoke began to clear. By 5:30, the outcome was visible. The Shahed Bagheri, once presented as Tehran's $555 million symbol of power, now drifted motionless on the water. Around it, the sea was scattered with the burned remains of drones and fast boats, the wreckage of a siege that had failed to reach its final goal. From the American destroyers, RHIB boats carrying Navy Special Operations teams moved quickly across the waves toward the remaining Iranian craft, many of which were now drifting without direction. With the mothership disabled and U.S. firepower still surrounding them, more than 20 Iranian operators threw their gear into the sea and raised their hands. The U.S. Navy took them into custody and provided medical assistance where needed. American commanders then made a careful choice. They stopped at the point of control. The threat had been neutralized, but the mothership was not sunk. It was a cold, deliberate decision meant to prevent the situation from turning into a wider conflict that neither side could easily reverse. The United States declared a tactical victory. The USS Abraham Lincoln had survived, the carrier group had broken the siege, and the Shahed Bagheri had been left powerless. But the cost was serious. The USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. suffered a major breach on its starboard side and had to return to port for repairs. The USS Spruance lost a key part of its radar capability. 2 helicopters were lost and 15 sailors were injured. The American fleet continued north, leaving the disabled Shahed Bagheri drifting behind as a warning to anyone watching. But inside the Pentagon, a new concern had already begun to grow. Iran had shown that it did not need its own carrier fleet to put pressure on the U.S. Navy. With planning, bold tactics, and a large combined swarm of air, surface, and underwater systems, it had managed to challenge the shield that many believed was nearly impossible to penetrate. At dawn over the Gulf of Oman, one message became clear. The age when American carrier groups could move through contested waters without serious opposition was no longer guaranteed.